Hey, thank you so much for joining YouTube podcast. However you are connecting with us today, we're stoked that you're here. And I have one of my best friends, Joseph Harris, who's with me today. Seriously, I love Joseph Harris. I love him for a whole plethora of reasons. But number one, just because he's a magnificent human. And so I want to introduce him to you. Say hello, Joseph.
Hi, guys. Thank you for that wonderful introduction. You are hilarious.
And honest, because like seriously, we
Yeah.
connect on like how many different levels? A million.
A million. Oh my gosh. More than we have time to talk.
Exactly. So I asked Joseph, I was like, hey, can you help me with the book, Hey God? Can we talk? And Joseph said, yeah, because Joseph is again magnificent. I think, did you decide to do chapter 7, the one about when plans change?
I did not. That's what was sent to me, but it actually works out perfectly because I have a history in God about when plans change. So
Yeah. And what does that look like for you? I mean, when you say you have a history in God, when plans change, give me some examples of what that looks like for you.
Sure. I actually think part of the reason why we're friends today was because I was able to share what happened to me when my plans changed with our dear friend Sean Bowles. And he had me on his podcast, and I was sharing about a few years ago in 2012 when the Lord had spoke to me to move to another state to pursue marriage with my fiance at the time. And she and I, had been together for about 5 years, and we knew it was the Lord's desire for us to get married and all of those different things. And when I moved out there, the Lord told me, he said, you're only going to be out there for a short time, but I didn't pay attention to it. So when I moved out there, I hated leaving home. I had never lived anywhere else. And I knew God had spoken to me to go there, but we ended up coming back home, cutting out a lot, but we've ended up coming back home here to Maryland to visit my family for Christmas. And while we did, we broke up. And the
Oh,
Lord
at
told me
Christmas time?
at Christmas time. It was horrible.
That sounds terrible.
It was bad. It was so bad. But the Lord reminded me during that time that he had told me, he said, Joseph, I told you that you would go to live in that state, but only for a short time. And he said, but you never asked me for how long. And it was then in that moment I remembered, or I realized, okay, don't just listen to God's instructions, but number one, be flexible enough to inquire the details of what he's saying.
Yeah.
And to know, like, if my plans change, I thought I was going to get married, but he knew what was going to happen, months after that. And I had to be flexible and go the way that God told me to go. Matter of fact, even before I left, to fly back home, I was going to go on a trip with another friend of mine. And he told me, he said, I want you to buy your ticket to go back home to Baltimore. And I said, Lord, I don't live in Baltimore. He said, buy your ticket to go home to Baltimore. And I didn't. I just said, I don't live in Baltimore. I live, where I was living with my fiance at the time. And then everything happened. And that's when I realized, okay, number one, always ask God for the details. Number two, be flexible to move and allow him to speak when our plans change, when things just happen that we thought were going to go a certain way. And then, he speaks to us and changes it.
Yeah. And I think it's interesting that like the real life example, like you telling us about how, hey, I thought we were doing this, but clearly it got adjusted when we were doing actually that.
Exactly.
And in the book, Hey God, this chapter is about when plans change.
Yes.
And so when you read, because this is like related to Samuel, when you read through some of this, did you find it helpful in terms of like personal experience for you and kind of doing a benchmark against Samuel?
Yes, absolutely. I thought about how God spoke to Samuel at a very young age. And at the time, God was speaking to me to do a lot of life things when I was younger. And oftentimes when that happens, people will discount you because you are a certain age.
Sure.
It seems like that's the case any age you are. You could be 10 years young or 90 years young. Well, maybe
Right.
not 90 years young, but if you just say, people have a hard time hearing, well, the Lord spoke to me
Yeah.
and told me to do this. And I think that Samuel's uniqueness of hearing God at his young age, and then just the pattern, I guess, of his life, how it evolved into the fullness of what God had called him to do, and his consistency in wanting to hear God no matter what he was presented with, especially like when he was when the Lord told him to anoint David, anoint the next king of Israel. And in his mind, he's like, okay, I'm going to go do this. But as he went to go fulfill what God told him to do, he was still insisting on hearing what God wanted in that moment. He thought it was going to be, the older brother. And God's like, no,
Right.
no, no, but I thought you told me to go anoint the king of Israel. Yes, I did. But in this, it's very specific. It's very, God has his, you said it a specific way. I don't know if I wrote it down, but you said that, how did you say it? You said, God has his own preferences. I loved that when I read that in the book. And it's so true. Like we have our own preferences and our own desires based on what God has said to us. But we have to realize that our preferences and our desires have to still match what his is, even in regards to what he's actually speaking to us, if that makes sense.
Yeah. And I think sometimes we think God said this, and then we kind of extrapolate,
Yeah, we
like,
add to it.
Yeah. And then, so that you said this, so then that means this plus this is, and we just kind of add and then we get ourselves kind of off, and it seems like, hey, God,
Yeah,
you changed your mind. And when we go back, like you said, God said, I'm going to be here in this state for a short amount of time. And then kind of projecting, oh, well, that means then, translated, interpreted, that means this, this, and this. Then we kind of push into it our own preferences. And I think sometimes we get ourselves in trouble with that.
We really do. Actually, if I could take a minute and speak on that, I was just speaking at another church a couple of weeks ago, maybe about a month ago, that asked me to speak for an event that they were having. And during the worship time, you always have worship before someone speaks, but during that time, the person that was up there leading was just, he was really wanting to fire God to come. He was really, going after it, and just, well, it was just so much going on. But in my heart, I actually did not feel like the Lord wanted me to connect to that in any way. So I just sat there, I opened my Bible. He had everybody getting up and doing all these different things. And I knew the Lord was speaking something different to me. So I'm sitting there, opening my Bible, reading it. And the Lord starts talking to me. And he's like, Joseph, just because you want something to happen, knowing that it's my desire to come, it's my desire to manifest the glory, it's my desire for the presence to come. But he said, that cannot happen on your own terms. Just because you want something, just because you want me to do something, just because I'm going to come, it doesn't mean that it can happen on your terms or the way that you determine it. And I took that away, realizing, what you just shared and what you just spoke on in relation to this, that we have to, just because God has said something, it doesn't mean that we take that and we run with it in our own preferences and our own terms, and our own vision of how we see it and how we want it to come to pass. God's words that are eternal. It's God's words that are spoken over us that he is responsible to fulfill, not our own preferences and our own desires.
And I think too, and I love that, because I think that we have these ideas, and this is, what it looks like and how it gets, expressed and demonstrated and all that. And I think it's interesting too, in this particular chapter, Samuel anoints Saul because that's who God had chosen at that time. but I think it's interesting too that God looks at the human will, right? Saul
Uh,
didn't really fall into, cadence with
mhm.
God. Um,
Right.
and I appreciate that God has some bandwidth for
Yeah.
our free will
Hmm.
and takes that into consideration. So sometimes when plans change, I think we also have to not just like blame God, right?
No.
Hey, or I totally screwed up and missed it
Yeah.
altogether. But I think we also have to plug into the consideration free will, um,
Absolutely.
because that's a piece of it, right?
It is. It's true, and
Mm-hmm.
that's what makes God God. I think that's what makes him the best father there ever is, and ever was, and ever will be,
Mm-hmm.
because he knows just what you said, that we will make mistakes.
Yeah.
He knows that he has a plan, and then the plan changes because we added to it, or we, went away from his original instructions. But
Yeah.
he's so good in his love that he allows us to have that free will and
Mm-hmm.
still factor in protection for
Mm-hmm.
us,
Mm-hmm.
even when we miss it. Like, that's the
Mm-hmm.
goodness of God. That's the
Yeah.
beauty of who
Mm-hmm.
he is. And I'm grateful for it, because I've not been perfect
Yeah.
in following the fullness of his plan, but
Mm-hmm.
I aim to be, and I aim to continue to strive to live out and walk in the fullness of what his desires are for us.
Yeah. And keeping that flexibility so that when plans
Yes.
change, some of our viewers, our listeners, um, some of us are really good at that adapting flexible stuff, and then some
Mhm.
of us are a little rigid. Inflexible, right? So
Yes.
Joseph, what would you say to somebody who struggles? They want, plans and process, and they want certainty and security, and they don't want change and adaptability. They don't want to be flexible. What would you say to that person?
You're speaking to me. If anybody's known me for a long time, they would know I used to always say I hate change. I
Yeah.
hate the idea of change. I hate the feeling of change. It's
Yeah.
extreme uncomfortability. It's,
Yeah.
if that's a word, it's it it really is. It really just makes me feel sometimes, or it has made me feel sometimes, very uncomfortable. And
Yeah.
it's because, number one, I realized that when God was challenging me to change, or giving me the invitation to change, it was because he had something better for me than what I perceived.
Yeah.
And once I realized that it was an invitation to encounter him, it's an invitation to encounter his love, that's when I put my faith
Mhm.
and trust fully in him, to realize, hey, this is
Mhm.
not something that I have to fear about. Perfect love casts out all fear, the Bible says,
Right.
and dispels every trace of terror. So oftentimes, whenever I would feel that invitation, that's the natural feeling that would come, was fear. What's going to happen? The fear of the
Yeah.
future. What if I make a mistake?
Yeah.
And that's where that being rigid comes from, like you were just describing. But I think if you know, number one, that God loves you, and that he's big enough to be God even if you make a mistake,
Mhm.
then you have full force to just go right ahead
Mhm.
and step out in faith in what God's specifically saying to you.
Mhm.
Then the other side of that, and I wrote this down, I loved what you said about how God does use others to help teach us how to hear him too as
Yeah.
well.
Yeah.
And I just love that example, and the examples that you used in the book. And I was thinking about that for my own life, of my journey in history and God, of how many times he used other people to
Mhm.
help me change, to
Mhm.
help me say yes, to help me, to help encourage me. That's the gift of prophecy, right?
Right.
Simple gift, edification, exhortation, and
Right.
comfort.
Yeah.
And God uses prophetic utterance through people to help us step out in faith, to help us uh, change, the directions that we might be insisting on, so that we can encounter God's love in a beautiful, beautiful way.
Mhm. I love that. I love that, because a lot of times we get in our little niche and then we
Yes.
miss this giant garden.
Yeah. Yes.
Mhm. It's totally
It's
cool.
true.
Any
Yep.
thoughts? Any thoughts on the conversation starter for this chapter?
I thought that, no, actually, Sarah, you're like a master writer, number one. So for me, it is like your books are always some of the easiest, most profound books to read. That I think that, again, it just gives you, instead of, remember I was just saying just a minute ago, like God uses other people sometimes to help you hear
Yeah.
and begin a conversation. That's literally what this book is, as well as those conversation starters. So no real questions from me on that, just like an invitation to say, hey, do that. Be sure to me, they're activations.
Yeah.
They're ways to activate the revelation that is coming forward, not just from the chapter, but from the entire book as well.
Yeah. And I think too, what I was trying to do is craft a variety,
Yes.
appreciating that each person who reads this book is unique. So you can't
Yes.
make like a cookie cutter, like a
Yeah.
formula. This is structure,
Yep.
ABC, it's not an
Yep.
outline, but it's really
Yep.
more personal, individual. So
Yeah.
that was kind of my heart. So
And that came through literally just in the one chapter I read. Everything
nice.
that you said definitely came through.
Nice. Thank you, Joseph. Make
You're welcome.
sure that you come and hang out with me. I want to cook for you again. I get
Amen.
all
She
of my
makes
kids.
the best steak. Oh my gosh, the best steak, potato pie, anything that you could think of. I'm telling you, she's
Mhm.
and I've been honored and privileged to eat other chefs' food. You kicked their butt. I'm telling you,
Yeah,
you're
I don't know. You're polite and
no,
gracious.
I'm being serious. I ain't got no reason to lie.
But did we make you? I don't remember. Did we make you the blueberry goat cheese basil pie? We did, right?
No,
No.
I did not hear about that one.
So
That will have to be the next one.
that's the next appointment. That's the next dinner. Yeah, man, I'm totally stoked. So thank you for doing Hey God,
Bye.
Conversations with God. Joseph, you are one of my favorite friends all time,
Same
hands
here.
down. So
Love you.
muchos gracias.
Thank you so much.
Thank you.